Hello, my name is Prior Chad, and I'm the vicar at St. Augustine's Episcopal Parish in Tempe, Arizona. The following sermon was delivered on January 3rd, 2016, the second Sunday after Christmas Day. The epistle for this Sunday was from Ephesians, in which we hear language of adoption and inheritance used to describe the saints' relationship to God. The gospel for this Sunday was taken from Matthew chapter 2, in which we hear the story of the flight of the Holy Family to Egypt to escape Herod the Great. I hope the sermon gives you an opportunity to reflect upon the concepts of adoption and inheritance as they relate to your relationship to God. And I pray that you will be able to see in St. Joseph a model for your own calling and vocation. Blessings upon you.
Let no evil talk come out of my mouth, but only what is useful for building up as there is need, so that my words may give grace to those who hear. In the name of the Holy and undivided Trinity. Amen. When my wife, Jana, worked in infant adoptions for Catholic Charities, she found that many families who entered the process feeling one way about the prospect of adopting a child ended up with quite a different feeling when the process was complete. She says that on the front end of the long series of interviews, profiles, and prospective matches, many couples thought of themselves as doing a merciful deed for a baby in need of a home, as big-hearted providers for some vulnerable child out there. But at the end, when they finally held their daughter or son in their arms, these couples often described themselves as feeling like it was they who had been shown mercy, they for whom a home had been provided, they who, by virtue of forces and factors far outside of their control, had been brought into and made a family. St. Joseph is often associated with adoption, being regarded by the Church as the adopted father of Jesus. But I wonder if Joseph's relationship to the dynamics of adoption, like that of the parents I just described, is a bit more complicated than it first appears. Is it Joseph who adopts Jesus? Or might it be more accurate to say that St. Joseph is the one who is adopted? Does Joseph make room in his home for the child of questionable progeny? Or have forces and factors outside of his control brought him into a life he could never have imagined on his own? In fact, I wonder if the language of adoption throughout much of Holy Scripture is rather more complicated than we often perceive. The way our lesson from Ephesians this morning uses this language is a good example. The passage employs the metaphor of adoption as one way to describe a shift in consciousness resulting from the glorious grace God freely bestowed on us in the Beloved. The language of adoption here is tied to being given a spirit of wisdom and revelation that leads to the eyes of our heart being enlightened, so that we are able to see the truth of our calling and identity. Adoption does not give us our identity as God's children, an identity we have from before the foundations of the world. It awakens us to it. Adoption is a metaphor for enlightenment, for spiritual awakening. But this isn't the end of the adoption metaphor here in Ephesians. Part of the calling to which we are awakened is our identity as God's own inheritance. And this is an unusual turn in the language of family. One doesn't receive inheritance from the generation that follows one's own. One receives inheritance from the generation that came before. So what is this twisting of the metaphor trying to say? Are we adopted as children of God, and yet God receives an inheritance from us, as one would from one's parents? Let us see if the life and experience of St. Joseph, as described in Matthew's Gospel, can help us make sense of these complicated family dynamics we see in Ephesians. As we touched on earlier, Joseph is one who has experienced the awakening of adoption. And we see from his life what it looks like for someone to be given a spirit of wisdom and revelation, and who lives with the eyes of his heart enlightened. In today's Gospel, an angel appears to Joseph 3 times in his dreams to give him instructions about how to keep Jesus and Mary safe. And these aren't the first times angels have visited Joseph in his dreams. In the previous chapter, an angel appears to Joseph to tell him about the nature of Mary's pregnancy, and that he should not be afraid to marry her. What we see in St. Joseph is a person who lives with his spiritual eyes wide open, and is therefore receptive to wisdom and revelation from God. We also see in Joseph a person who trusts his inner experience and has no resistance to heeding the received instructions from the angels. There are no barriers in Joseph's will that keep him from being able to freely and immediately do what he is called to do. And for this reason, St. Joseph's life in the context of Matthew's narrative provides a beautiful picture of how human beings can be a rich inheritance for God. One great mystery we celebrate in this Christmas season is the wonder that when God shows up in our world, God shows up fragile and vulnerable and in need of care. God does not come onto the scene with the strength of royal armies. God arrives in the weakness of a peasant's poverty. Joseph's life, awakened, enlightened, free to follow the leading of Spirit, is precisely the kind of life that is able to give to a fragile and vulnerable God what God needs. Joseph, a simple tradesman among a marginalized yet spiritually vibrant people, is God's rich inheritance among the saints. Joseph experiences the awakening of adoption by God, and thus becomes an inheritance for God, just as our passage from Ephesians describes. And through the life of St. Joseph, we can also observe a model for our own complicated experience around the dynamics of divine adoption and inheritance. Like Joseph, we can cultivate the capacity to live with the eyes of our heart enlightened, so that we can perceive God where God shows up, hidden in the everyday, in the mundane, in the inauspicious. We can open ourselves to wisdom and learn to receive guidance from the veiled realm of spirit. And like Joseph, our will can become so free to follow that guidance that the life we live can provide for the vital needs of the God who shows up weak, fragile, and vulnerable in our midst. It's often the case that our ideas about our role in a family change in the process of becoming a family. Where we're thinking we're leading, we find that we are being guided. Where we feel like we are in possession of a welcoming home, we find that we are welcomed into a home we could never create on our own. And where we feel like we have been given the gift of adoption and belonging, we find that we are called to become the gift of an inheritance. providing for, and protecting a fragile and infinitely valuable mystery. Let us give thanks for the lives of our forebears in faith, like St. Joseph, in whose footsteps we can walk as children and as parents